On our 25th wedding anniversary, he handed me a small velvet box. My heart fluttered until I opened it. Inside wasn't jewelry. It was a divorce proposal. "You deserve better, Lisa," he said. "I've fallen for someone younger." He thought that was mercy. What I gave him instead was justice. And if you've ever felt betrayed by someone who promised you forever, then do not just watch and be part of this. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know you're here by commenting where you are watching from right now. You are about to hear a story of heartbreak, strategy, and a payoff so satisfying you'll want to rewind it. Stay with me. You'll feel every sting and every victory. On the morning of our 25th wedding anniversary, the house smelled of ordinary things. Coffee brewing in the pot, the lemon-scented soap from a bulk pack, the faint, familiar dust of leather from his favorite armchair. Ordinary had been my armor. It kept me steady. I had built a life on steady things, paying bills on time, saving receipts, learning how he liked his eggs. This is the invisible architecture of a long marriage, the small, practical rituals that keep two lives from collapsing into chaos. You learn to map each other, the way he folds his socks, the soft sound he makes when he's concentrating. That one corner of his mouth that lifts just before he tells a joke. His name was Mark. He was the kind of man you instinctively trust. He could fix a leaking sink, calm your mother on the phone, and charm the TA into raising more money than ever. He had a laugh that sounded like genuine interest, like curiosity ready to break into mirth. He had a steady job, a tidy reputation, and a habit of calling me in the middle of the day just to ask how my lunch was. We had a daughter with a job and a stubborn boyfriend, a son who called with questions about his first lease, and a life that, from the outside, looked like the kind of success you could photograph and pin on a fridge. So when he pushed that small velvet box across the table that night, the world shrank to a single expectant point. I thought, naively, foolishly, that it would be a ring. Maybe something funny, an ironic piece, because he knew I valued a laugh over a diamond. My fingers trembled as I opened it. That's what the body does when it anticipates something tender. But tenderness was not inside. There was only a folded piece of paper. He looked at me with the practiced softness of a man who had rehearsed this compassion in the mirror for weeks. "Elisa," he said, his voice measured, like an anchor. "Oh, you deserve better. I've fallen for someone younger. I think we should separate." There is a single suspended instant that feels like the first frame of an old movie where everything slows and you see the dust dancing in the light. I remember the exact way the lamplight caught the gray in his hair that I'd somehow missed. I remember the metallic taste that rose in the back of my throat. His words were antiseptic, clinical. He had wrapped his betrayal in a bow of concern, as if he were doing me a kindness. The first wave that hit me wasn't rage. It was a cold, blinding clarity, as if someone had ripped down the heavy curtains and let the harsh, full daylight pour in. I could taste the salt on my own lip and hear the lonely hiss of the coffee kettle. For 25 years, I had smoothed his wrinkles. I had mailed birthday cards to his colleagues. I had folded his shirts with a precision he never noticed. I had been steady. I was the background of his life, the safe harbor. He had been my partner in a million small daily things. He was the one who made the world feel reliable. But he had spent years quietly eroding that trust like a slow, patient tide. The signs were there, and I had expertly ignored them. The late nights he called to work. The phone he now kept face down on the table, displaying a wallpaper I'd never seen. A laugh that sometimes felt rehearsed. I had always assumed I could forgive him. I believed we would work through anything like we always had. I never noticed he was already drafting a new story for his life, one where I was relegated to the role of a side character. Humiliation is a particular kind of pain. It's not sharp like a cut, but wide and cold, like a puddle you can't step around. He had reduced my life to a simple adjective, a tired, a stuck, he passed, while he paraded his new one around, like a badge of courage. He had arranged the entire narrative to make himself look brave and me look at best sentimental. For a few nights, I let the house become what it truly was, a vessel of echoes. I let myself sob with that raw animal sound that steals the air from your lungs. I let my son's concerned voice trail off on the phone. I let the dog curl at the foot of the bed and not move. I cried until the tears ran dry and my pillowcase was stiff with salt. But grief, like any deep pain, requires motion. After that first abysmal week, a cold realization settled in my bones. The person who would save me from the life he was trying to hand me was not going to show up at my door. There would be no rescuing cavalry. If I wanted to emerge from this with my dignity, with some shred of a future I could recognize, I had to plan. I needed a revenge that would be surgical and unmistakable. Not a childish tantrum, not a scream at a party, but a correct and precise accounting. He had stolen the public story of our marriage. I would take from him the one thing he treasured more than anything else: his pristine reputation. There is an art to planning this kind of revenge, and it is rarely romantic. It is built of paperwork and patience. It is about finding the right allies. It is learning how cold, impersonal institutions think. It's boring in the way novels tell you not to be, and it is devastatingly effective. My plan had to accomplish 3 things. Expose his deception where it would hurt him the most, in his social and professional circles. Protect our children from the gratuitous ugliness of a public spectacle. And leave him financially and reputationally altered in a way that could never be fixed with a slick apology or a PR campaign. The first step was gathering evidence. The second was choosing the arena. Mark served on the board of a prestigious charity, one that mattered deeply to our city's elite. He loved that stage, the black-tie galas, the easy applause, the photos in the society pages. If there was anything that could make a man like Mark feel small, it was the unyielding weight of bureaucracy. A board like that runs on procedure and respect. And sometimes, the polite, procedural nature of an institution can destroy a man who has always used charm as a substitute for integrity. I reached out to 3 people in the space of a week. My sister, who offered her couch if things got ugly, and a shoulder I could cry on. And a shoulder I could cry on. A lawyer, whose name a friend whispered to me, sent a list of documents that matter in both divorce and corporate scrutiny. Invoices, travel receipts, expense accounts, any piece of paper that tied business spending to a personal life. The third was a private investigator, not the dark, cinematic type, but a practical man with dry eyes named Hassan, who had watched too many lives unravel to be sentimental about any of them. Hassan found what I had always, in some deep part of me, known was there. We live in a world where the footnotes of an accounting ledger can be as damning as a stolen love letter. There were invoice patterns that coincided perfectly with Mark's business trips. There was travel booked for weekends he claimed to be a working late. There were transfers from the firm labeled as consultation fees that magically aligned with invoices from a boutique for the woman he was courting. The evidence was cold, factual, and unemotional. It didn't need to scream. It only needed to whisper in the language that institutions understand. Money trails speak to auditors in a dialect that the language of romance can never translate. I printed everything. I filed dates. I cross-referenced locations. I worked in utter silence because a spectacle would be tempting but ultimately clumsy. So, there is a profound difference between getting even and being deliberate. The former is hot and fleeting. The latter is cold and it lasts. Of course there was opposition. When our son Daniel called me, his voice raw with panic, he begged me to stop. "A mom, please," he said, the words cracking. "Oh, don't make this about revenge. Don't drag our name through the mud. I don't want our family to be news." I thought about my son's fear, and then I thought about what Mark had done. He had taken our quiet, private life and turned it into a cheap theater production, with me playing the fool. I owed my children the truth, but I also owed them protection, so I adapted. I narrowed the audience. I would expose Mark only where he had the most to lose, within the board and the fundraising community. It would be a place where an audit couldn't be shrugged off, where the consequences would be institutional, not tabloid. It was surgical. It was precise. It was the kind of humiliation that makes a man count every single small loss. The night of the annual charity gala was everything it was designed to be: unforgettable. High, vaulted ceilings, soft, golden lights, a string quartet weaving a soundtrack of silk through the air. The country club was packed with people who cared about the right causes and, more importantly, the right names. Mark was in his element. He loved it the way a moth loves a flame, drawn to the light with a fatal, fluttering confidence. 2 days earlier, I had hand-delivered a plain, heavy folder to the office of the board's chairman, an older, serious man named Vernon. I requested a discreet review before the gala. The folder contained a simple timeline: transfers, dates, invoices, and, most crucially, a digital recording. Hassan, the pie, had captured audio from a recent business dinner. On it, Mark, believing he was among confidants, joked about a creative write-off fee and the logistics of maintaining two separate lives. You could hear his familiar, triumphant laugh. You could also hear him calmly explain how certain luxury expenses were for the firm when they very clearly were not. The board did not shout. They did not stage a scene. Bureaucracy is quieter and far more precise than drama. They asked for details. They convened a quiet meeting. They spoke in low tones with their lawyers. And then, as Mark stood to approach the podium, beaming, the chairman, Vernon, placed a gentle hand on his arm. The microphone caught his soft, polite words. Mark, in light of new information, we feel it prudent to delay your remarks this evening. Prudent to delay your remarks. Imagine being in a room where admiration is your only currency, and you are just told you are bankrupt. Mark's face shifted from practiced ease to a blotchy, flustered crimson. He tried to laugh it off, to make a joke, but the moment was gone. The procedural language was a polite hand closing around his throat. The woman he had brought, young, pretty, a vision of breathy laughter in a cocktail dress, sat utterly frozen, her clutch held in a white-knuckled grip. His friends, who had moments before been slapping his back, now found urgent reasons to examine the art on the walls or check their phones. I sat at a small table near the back, and I felt a tight, quiet ache of pleasure in my chest. This was not the heat of rage or the chaos of a scene. It was the cold, clean satisfaction of truth finally meeting consequence. He had built his life on the assumption that his charm was a force field. Tonight, he learned it was not. In the days that followed, the slow, grinding machinery of consequence began to turn. The board announced a formal audit. Key donors, smelling the faint scent of scandal, began asking careful, pointed questions. A journalist who had been tipped off began to dig, her articles shifting the story from a personal scandal to a matter of fiduciary responsibility. Mark's phone, once a tool for making deals and weekend plans, became a torrent of demands for explanation, for meetings, for damage control. He scrambled, as men who use charisma as their only currency always do, but this was a fire that could not be put out with a charming smile. This was about numbers, about records, about the unyielding language of law and finance. He called me one afternoon, his voice thin and strained, a wire about to snap. "Elisa," he said, "please, we need to talk. I can explain everything. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "You meant for it to be hidden," I replied, my voice calm and level. "You meant to build your new life while the old one was still paying your bills." He stammered, he prevaricated. He blamed an overzealous assistant, a misunderstanding in accounting, the pressures of his position. But when the board's lawyers began their formal interviews and the press calls started coming to his office, his charm dissolved into a pathetic stream of denials that sounded as hollow as they were. Humiliation, I learned, is a multi-layered thing. It can be social, the averted gaze, the suddenly busy calendar. It can be financial, the frozen accounts, the renegotiated contracts. But for a man like Mark, the most profound humiliation was the procedural one. It was the slow, inexorable process of becoming a problem to be managed, a liability to be contained. People he had considered friends now spoke to him with a careful, professional distance, their words laced with a new and devastating pity. He was no longer Mark, the charismatic fundraiser. He was Mark, the subject of the audit. The younger woman, the one for whom he had shattered our life, did what such people do. She vanished. The photos on social media were deleted. The phone number was disconnected. She had been a beautiful prop in the theater of his midlife crisis, and when the stage lights turned harsh and the audience began to boo, she exited stage left without a backward glance. I did not revel in the rubble. I had no desire to be a cartoon villainess. My focus was on containment, on protecting what was left. Daniel, who had initially begged for peace, called me a few weeks later. His voice was quieter, more thoughtful. "You were right to be careful, Mom," he said. I didn't want to see you become a headline." The headline was already written, Daniel. I told him gently. I just made sure it was printed with the correct facts. The legal and financial processes were not swift. They were a slow, grinding parade of meetings, document exchanges, and tense negotiations. The board, true to its nature, was precise and risk-averse. Their final report was a dry, devastating document that spoke of breaches of fiduciary duty and financial irregularities. The media, now fully engaged, reported it not as a salacious affair, but as a story of corporate governance and failed oversight. This language was crucial. It transformed his personal betrayal into a professional failing, a sin against the ledger book that was far harder to forgive in his world than a sin against his marriage vows. He tried to bargain, of course. He sent long, rambling emails drafted by a PR firm, filled with non-apologies and justifications. He asked for private, off-the-record meetings. But the board, now armed with cold, hard data, was immune to his charm. His name became quietly attached to official complaints. Long-standing donors began to redirect their funds to other, less problematic organizations. The invitations to speak, to host, to be the face of anything simply stopped coming. The most satisfying part of his downfall was not the public shame. It was the private, quiet isolation. It was watching him walk into a room and seeing the subtle shift in the atmosphere. It was the handshake that lasted exactly 3 seconds before the other person found a reason to turn away. It was the knowledge that in the places where he had once felt like a king, he was now a ghost. That is a humiliation that no amount of money or spin can ever fix. There were, of course, financial consequences. The audit's findings gave me significant leverage in our divorce negotiations. There were clauses in his corporate contracts about fiduciary responsibility. In the end, he was forced to relinquish certain positions, accept financial penalties, and agree to a settlement that was far more equitable than the one he had initially offered me. I did not seek to leave him destitute. That would have been a cruelty that mirrored his own. I sought fairness. I sought a rectification of the ledger. That is not the same as revenge. It is justice. There were 2 conversations that stand as hinges, the moments where the entire story could have turned. The first was in our kitchen, in the strange flat light of a weekday afternoon, after his suspension was announced. He stood, one hand gripping the countertop as if the floor were tilting beneath him. "Why, Lisa?" he demanded, his voice brittle with a confusion that felt both genuine and profoundly stupid. "Why would you destroy everything we built?" "You handed me a velvet box with a letter inside," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "You offered me my own humiliation, dressed up as mercy. You presented me with the tally of my life and told me it was no longer valuable." His face flushed a mottled red, then went pale. "I never did anything illegal," he muttered, as if legality was the only measure of morality. "Not at first," I agreed. "But you lied. You moved money. You hid your tracks. You thought you could live 2 lives and the rest of us would just be the scenery." He leaned forward, his eyes wild with a sudden desperate anger. "You think this ruins me?" I let out a small dry laugh. "Ruin? No, Mark. I wanted accountability. I wanted an honest accounting. I wanted people to stop pretending that destroying a family is a brave new beginning." It was a surreal thing to watch a man who had built his identity on charm be reduced to arguing the semantics of spreadsheet entries. His outrage seemed small and pathetic in our familiar kitchen. The second conversation was shorter, sharper. It happened in the carpeted corridor just off the grand ballroom, moments after he had been escorted from the stage. He found me near the coat check, his face a mask of stunned fury. "Was this really necessary?" he hissed, the words a tangled knot of plea and threat. "I wasn't necessary to let you stand on that stage and pretend to be a pillar of the community while you were secretly diverting its funds?" I replied, my words short and cold. "Yes, it was." He reached out and grabbed my arm, a reflexive gesture of ownership that felt small and pathetic. "You've gone too far, Lisa." I turned and looked at him, my gaze steady and surgical. "I went exactly far enough," I said. "I went far enough to ensure you could never erase me with a velvet box." His mouth opened, and for a fleeting second, I saw the ghost of the man I had loved, bewildered, entitled, and ultimately, a child. Then he turned and walked away, a man chased by questions for which he had no good answers. When the consequences finally settled, a heavy quiet descended upon my life. What can I call? It was a release, the feeling of putting down a burden of stones I had been carrying for years. But it came with a cost. There were whispers at the grocery store, a few nasty headlines that stung more than I expected. The worried looks my children had to field from their friends. I worked tirelessly to shield them, to be the buffer between their lives and the mess their father had created. They were the collateral damage in his war on our marriage, and protecting them was my final, and most important, act in this entire drama. The final, perfect humiliation for him was almost intimate in its smallness. He received the board's formal letter of dismissal, pending a full investigation, while he was alone in an elevator. He called me from there, the fluorescent lights bleaching all color from his face, his voice a thin, reedy thread. "Elisa," he said, the word barely a whisper. Please, can we just talk? You had 25 years to talk to me honestly, Mark," I said, my voice calm and final. You made a different choice." The sound that came from him then was not a word, but a noise, the static of a man whose script had been ripped to shreds. In the months that followed, he tried every trick to regain his footing. He offered me money in discreet, almost shameful ways. He tried to use his remaining charm on the more sympathetic members of the board. He even paid for a series of carefully placed op-eds about redemption and learning from failure. But a reputation is a delicate tapestry. Once the threads of trust are pulled, the whole thing begins to unravel in a way that can never be perfectly rewoven. The people who had once been his staunchest allies now treated him with the cautious distance one reserves for a potentially contagious disease. And I began the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding. I took a small shelved dream off the shelf, a consultancy to advise local charities on grassroots fundraising. It was modest, but it was mine. The first time I sent an invoice under my own name and saw the payment clear, the satisfaction was quiet and deep, a feeling far more profound than any moment of revenge. I even found the strength to volunteer for the very board that had once been his kingdom, eventually earning a seat at the table not as a victim or a spectacle, but as someone with hard-won expertise and integrity. There are mornings now where I make my coffee and the light through the window is just ordinary light. It is no longer an armor, but a simple comfort. I do not wake up thinking of revenge. I wake up thinking about what I will build today. My son calls just to chat. My daughter laughs on the phone about a silly mistake she made at work. The house still holds its ghost, but they are my ghosts now. I choose which ones to acknowledge and which ones to let fade. If anyone asks me if I have any regrets, my answer is always the same. I regret the pain that splashed onto my children. I regret that our private life had to become a public lesson, but I do not, for a single second, regret refusing to be erased. I do not regret choosing a fierce, demanding dignity over a quiet, complicit silence. The satisfaction I feel is not the hot glee of Schadenfreude. It is the cold, clear rightness of justice. It was a realignment of the universe. The world, in its dull, bureaucratic, and utterly merciless way, had finally said to him, "You cannot hide certain truths behind a charming smile." A year after it all ended, I was invited to speak at a charity luncheon on the topic of resilience. After I finished, a woman approached me. She placed a gentle hand on my arm and said, "You handled all that with more grace than I could have ever mustered." She smelled of expensive perfume and genuine empathy. In that moment, I felt a sense of recognition, not the hollow fame of a tabloid subject, but the quiet, earned respect of a survivor. So to any woman sitting in a quiet kitchen tonight, staring at a velvet box that holds her heartbreak, I say this: you are not defined by the story someone else decided to write for you. You are defined by the story you choose to write for yourself after. Choose truth, even when it is ugly. Choose steadiness, even when you are shaking. Choose to gather the facts, to build your case, to be the one who, when life tries to humiliate you, answers with a ledger in one hand and a clean, clear voice in the other. And if you ask me, was it satisfying to see him standing there, speechless and exposed? Yes. It was deeply, profoundly satisfying. It was the clean, sharp satisfaction of a balance being restored. It was justice. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments. What's the most satisfying act of justice you've ever witnessed? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that land deep, and share this one if you know someone who needs a little courage today.